As the night falls and the darkness creeps in, the world around us changes. Shadows seem to grow longer and the silence becomes deafening. But what happens when the silence is broken by the sound of footsteps that don't belong to anyone you know? What happens when you hear a whisper in your ear but there's no one there? Welcome to our world of horror, where the unknown is the only certainty and fear is the only emotion. Brace yourself, because the journey we're about to take is not for the faint of heart. The group of 4 couples had been planning their weekend getaway for months. They were all friends from college, and they wanted to escape the stress of their busy lives for a few days. They had rented a cabin in a secluded area of the woods, hoping to enjoy some peace and quiet. They arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon, excited to spend the weekend together. As the evening wore on, they lit a fire and opened a few bottles of wine. They laughed and talked about old times, enjoying each other's company. They were all settling in for a relaxing night when there was a knock on the door. At first, they thought it might be a neighbor or someone lost in the woods. But as soon as one of them opened the door, they knew something was wrong. Several masked figures burst into the cabin, shouting and wielding weapons. The couples were caught off guard and tried to fight back, but they were quickly overpowered. The kidnappers were ruthless and efficient, and soon the couples were all tied up and blindfolded. They had no idea what was happening or why they were being kidnapped. As they were forced into the back of a van, the couples clung to each other, terrified of what was to come. They had heard stories of kidnappings in the news, but they never imagined it could happen to them. They were jostled around as the van drove through winding roads, and they had no idea where they were headed. When the van finally came to a stop, the couples were dragged out and taken into a dark and dingy building. They could hear the sounds of other people crying and screaming, and they knew that they were not alone. The kidnappers were organized and methodical, and they seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The couples were separated and taken to separate rooms, where they were subjected to various forms of torture. They were beaten, burned, and shocked with electricity. They were given very little food and water, and they were kept awake for days on end. They had no idea why they were being tortured, or who their captors were. They could only hope and pray for a way to escape. As the days wore on, the couples began to feel hopeless. They had no idea if anyone was looking for them, or if they would ever be found. They clung to each other for support, trying to stay strong and stay alive. They had no idea what was to come next, but they knew that they had to fight for their survival. The couples were blindfolded and taken to separate rooms, where they were subjected to unspeakable acts of torture. The kidnappers were ruthless, and they seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain on their victims. The couples were beaten, burned, and shocked with electricity. They were given very little food and water, and they were kept awake for days on end. The torture was relentless, and the couples had no idea when it would end. They screamed and begged for mercy, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. They had no idea who their captors were, or what they wanted. They felt completely helpless and alone. Despite their agony, the couples tried to maintain hope. They talked to each other through the walls, sharing stories of their lives and trying to keep each other's spirits up. They talked about their families and loved ones, and they promised to stay strong and fight for their survival. As the days wore on, the couple's bodies began to break down. They were covered in bruises and burns, and their muscles ached from being bound for so long. They were starving and dehydrated, and they could barely stay awake. They had no idea how much time had passed since their kidnapping, and they were beginning to lose all sense of time. One day, the couples were given a small amount of food and water. They were surprised and grateful, but they knew that it was probably a ploy to keep them alive for more torture. However, they had to take the chance and eat what they were given, as they were desperately hungry. Despite their weakened state, the couples began to think of ways to escape. They knew that they couldn't wait for someone to rescue them. They had to take matters into their own hands. They listened for any clues or conversations from their captors, hoping to piece together any information that might lead to their escape. As they listened, they began to hear whispers of a possible motive for their kidnapping. The kidnappers seemed to be after something specific, but they didn't know what it was. The couples realized that if they could figure out what the kidnappers were after, they might be able to use it as leverage to escape. In the meantime, the torture continued. The couples were burned with hot irons, shocked with electricity, and forced to endure unspeakable acts of violence. They clung to each other for support, promising to never give up hope. They knew that they had to stay alive and find a way to escape, no matter what. As the days turned into weeks, the couples continued to endure the brutal torture at the hands of their unknown captors. But they had not given up hope yet. In fact, they were beginning to find ways to use their pain to their advantage. They had started to listen to the conversations of their captors, trying to glean any clues or information about their motives. They had even managed to overhear a few conversations that hinted at their captors' identities. They knew that they needed to use this information to their advantage. One day, one of the couples, Alex and Sarah, managed to loosen their restraints enough to communicate through the wall. They shared what they had learned with the others, and they realized that the kidnappers might be after a valuable artifact that one of them had recently discovered. They were all shocked to learn this, but they knew that this information could be the key to their escape. They decided to use this knowledge to try to negotiate with their captors. They knew that they had nothing to lose and that their only chance of survival was to find a way out of their captivity. They started to think about ways to use the information they had to their advantage. They knew that they needed to make contact with their captors and try to negotiate a way out. They also knew that they needed to find a way to get to the artifact and use it as a bargaining chip. After days of planning, they finally came up with a plan. They would start to make noise in their cells, banging on the walls and shouting. They hoped that this would draw the attention of their captors and get them to come to their cells. When they did, they would try to negotiate with them. The couples put their plan into action, and it worked. Their captors came to their cells to see what was going on. The couple started to negotiate, telling them that they knew about the artifact and that they were willing to help them get it. They hoped that this would be enough to earn their captors' trust and get them to release them. At first, their captors were skeptical, but they eventually started to listen to what the couples had to say. They agreed to take them to the artifact, but only under the condition that they would not try to escape. The couples had no choice but to agree, and they were taken to a secret location where the artifact was hidden. Once they arrived at the location, the couples quickly realized that their captors had no intention of releasing them. They were once again held captive and forced to endure more torture. But now they had a glimmer of hope. They had discovered the identity of their captors and had a better understanding of their motives. They knew that they had to keep fighting for their survival and find a way to escape once and for all. The couples had been held captive for what seemed like an eternity, enduring unspeakable torture at the hands of their captors. But they had not given up hope, and they were determined to find a way out. One day, the couples managed to escape from their cells and began to search for a way out. They knew that they had to be careful, as their captors were likely to be watching their every move. As they made their way through the dark corridors of the compound, they suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind them. They quickly turned around and saw their captors, who had been alerted to their escape. A fierce battle ensued, with the couples using their wits and their newfound strength to fight off their captors. After a grueling battle, the couples emerged victorious. But their triumph was short-lived, as they realized that their captors had set up traps throughout the compound to prevent them from leaving. They knew that they had to be careful and cautious if they wanted to make it out alive. As they made their way through the compound, they came across a room that contained a large, ornate chest. The couples realized that this must be the artifact that their captors had been after. They knew that they had to take it with them if they wanted to use it as leverage against their captors. But as they reached for the chest, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They quickly realized that their captors had caught up to them, and they were now trapped in the room. As the couples prepared to make their final stand, they suddenly heard the sound of sirens outside. They knew that the police had arrived and that their ordeal was finally over. The couples were rescued and taken to the hospital for treatment. They were all battered and bruised, but they were alive. They had survived their harrowing ordeal and had managed to uncover the mystery of their captors' identities and motives. In the weeks that followed, the couples tried to put their lives back together. They struggled with the physical and emotional scars of their captivity, but they were grateful to be alive. They knew that they had been given a second chance and that they needed to make the most of it. As they looked back on their experience, they realized that they had learned a valuable lesson. They had learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. They had learned that they were stronger than they ever thought possible and that they could overcome even the most terrifying of challenges. The couples knew that they would never forget their experience, but they also knew that they had to move on. They had been given a second chance at life, and they were determined to make the most of it. The couples had survived their harrowing ordeal, but they knew that their journey was far from over. They had to deal with the physical and emotional scars left by their captivity, but they were determined to move forward and start anew. One of the couples, John and Sarah, had been planning to get married before their kidnapping. After their rescue, they decided to go through with their wedding, even though it would be difficult to put the memories of their captivity behind them. The other couples, Alex and Lisa, and Tom and Emily, had also suffered greatly during their time in captivity. They had to undergo therapy and counseling to help them cope with the trauma they had experienced. As time passed, the couple started to heal and grow stronger. They realized that their experience had changed them forever, but they also knew that they had to move on and not let their captors continue to control their lives. John and Sarah decided to take a trip to Europe for their honeymoon, hoping to put some distance between themselves and their past. They visited museums, art galleries, and other tourist spots, trying to create new memories that would help them forget their ordeal. Alex and Lisa, on the other hand, decided to start a charity organization to help victims of kidnapping and abuse. They wanted to use their experience to make a positive impact on the world and help others who had gone through similar traumas. Tom and Emily decided to start a family. They had always talked about having children, and after their ordeal, they knew that life was too short to wait. They wanted to create a loving home and raise their children in a safe and nurturing environment. As time passed, the couple stayed in touch, offering each other support and encouragement. They knew that they had a unique bond, forged through their shared experience, and they were grateful to have each other to lean on. Eventually, the couples were able to move on with their lives, although they would never forget their ordeal. They had learned to appreciate life in a new way, knowing that every moment was precious and should be treasured. In the end, they had proven to themselves and to their captors that they were survivors. They had overcome the most terrifying of challenges and had emerged stronger on the other side. They had learned to never give up hope and to always believe in the power of the human spirit. Their story would go down in history as one of the most harrowing tales of survival, inspiring others to never give up in the face of adversity. The couples had proven that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that sometimes the most frightening experiences can lead to the most profound growth and transformation.